On the fateful night of November 8, 1984, in a vacant house in San Antonio, Texas, a brutal robbery, a desperate struggle, and 9 gunshots claimed one life and left another clinging to survival. That was the tragic beginning of the story of Ruben Montoya Cantu, a teenager just 17 years old when he was convicted and ultimately paid with his life. From the criminal path of a street kid to the most controversial execution in Texas history, what truly happened in that house? Would the later retractions from the surviving victim and the change of heart from the prosecutor himself be enough to exonerate a man who was already dead? In today's video, we'll explore Ruben Cantu's final meal and the last words he spoke before his life ended. This case revolves around 2 main victims, Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno. On the night of November 8, 1984, both were construction workers sleeping on mattresses in a house under construction at 605 Briggs Street, San Antonio. However, the controversy surrounding the case began to simmer and then erupted strongly in the years that followed. Did this verdict truly deliver absolute justice? Or was it a hasty conviction of someone who might have been innocent, leaving behind unresolved questions? On August 24, 1993, at a Texas state prison 22 minutes past midnight, Ruben Montoya Cantu faced execution by lethal injection. He died at the age of 26, becoming the 5th juvenile offender executed in Texas. Cantu's last request was for a piece of chewing gum, but it was denied. When asked if he had a final statement, Cantu responded briefly and firmly, "No, sir." This silence in the final moments of his life only amplified the mystery surrounding his claims of innocence. The lethal injection process proceeded according to standard protocol. Cantu's death marked the end of a long and contentious legal process. However, for many, especially those who believed in his innocence, this death did not bring closure, but only opened up more haunting questions. Did Ruben Cantu's death truly bring comfort to the families of Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno, or did it deal a heavy blow to the belief in justice as new evidence continued to emerge, later suggesting Cantu might have been innocent? The case of Ruben Montoya Cantu is one of the most controversial executions in Texas and across the United States. It raises profound questions about justice, the accuracy of the judicial system, and the risk of executing an innocent person. What led a 17-year-old to be convicted and executed, while later evidence suggested he might have been innocent? The impact of this case is immense. For the Gomez and Moreno families, it was the pain of loss and physical and emotional scars that would never heal. However, for Cantu's family and his supporters, the case was a tragedy of injustice, a haunting thought of a life wrongly taken. The case also ignited fierce debate about the death penalty, especially for juvenile offenders. The fact that the surviving victim, Juan Moreno, the co-defendant David Garza, and even the district attorney Sam Millsap, who prosecuted Cantu's case, all retracted their statements or expressed doubts about the verdict, created a strong wave of protest. Sam Millsap, initially a lifelong supporter of the death penalty, changed his view, admitting that there's no way to get that certainty when seeking capital punishment. This highlights the potential flaws of the system and the risk of irreversible errors. The Ruben Cantu case reminds us of the terrible cost of a wrongful conviction. It forces us to reflect on the role of police in investigations, the reliability of witness testimony, and the pressure on prosecutors. How can we prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future? Do we have sufficient safeguards to ensure that no one is executed for a crime they didn't commit? This case leaves us with a bitter lesson about the fragility of justice and society's moral responsibility to protect human life. What are your thoughts on Ruben Cantu's case and the questions it raises about our justice system? Their purpose was to guard the site against theft, as a water heater had just been stolen from the property. Pedro Gomez, described as being 25 or 35 years old, was shot at least 9 times with a rifle and died instantly at the scene. He was sleeping in his work clothes with pockets full of earned cash when he was attacked. Juan Moreno, 19, was also shot up to 9 times with the same rifle. Despite being critically wounded, losing a lung, a kidney, and part of his stomach, Juan Moreno miraculously survived the attack and was able to call for help shortly after the incident. Both Gomez and Moreno were honest laborers brutally robbed of their belongings and lives while simply doing their job. They had no idea that this fateful moment would forever link them to one of the most controversial execution cases in the state of Texas. Gomez's tragic death and Moreno's horrific injuries left indelible pain for their families and community. Ruben Montoya Cantu, born December 5, 1966, grew up in a difficult environment in South San Antonio. He lived with his mother and father until he was 14 when his parents separated. Cantu's mother moved away, while Cantu continued to live with his father in a trailer in a crime-ridden neighborhood. This neighborhood was home to a delinquent gang called the Gray Eagles. Despite his small stature and being in special education classes, Cantu quickly became the leader of this group. By the age of 15, he was involved in an organized car theft ring, frequently driving stolen cars to Mexico for cash. In a climate where the San Antonio Police Department was embroiled in scandal with self-proclaimed drug dealers and corrupt police officers notorious in the community, Cantu delved deeper into illegal activities. Although Cantu's brother was arrested for drugs and theft, and Cantu himself had multiple run-ins with the police, he had never been convicted of anything before the November 1984 case, the very case that ultimately led to his execution. Did a troubled childhood, the influence of a criminal environment, and his early brushes with the law shape Ruben Cantu's path to this horrific crime? Or was there a more complex truth behind the facade of a street teenager? On the night of November 8, 1984, around 11:30 p.m., Ruben Cantu, then 17 years old, and his friend David Garza, 15 years old, broke into a house under construction in San Antonio. Their target was to rob 2 construction workers, Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno, who were sleeping on mattresses. Both Gomez and Moreno were asleep in their work clothes with pockets full of cash, completely unaware of the imminent danger. Cantu and Garza carried a rifle. They used this rifle to threaten and rob the 2 men of their wristwatches. When they tried to take the money, Pedro Gomez resisted attempting to retrieve a pistol hidden under his mattress. Immediately, Gomez was shot at least 9 times with the teenager's rifle and died on the spot. Next, Juan Moreno was also shot up to 9 times with the same rifle. Believing both men were dead, the 2 teenagers fled the scene. However, a miracle occurred. Juan Moreno survived the brutal attack. Despite being severely wounded, losing a lung, a kidney, and part of his stomach, he managed to crawl out of the house and call for help shortly after the robbers left. This crime was not merely an armed robbery. It was a horrifying act of violence demonstrating the coldness and cruelty of the perpetrators who were ready to kill to achieve their objectives. What drove these 2 teenagers to commit such brutal acts, and was the truth about who pulled the trigger truly revealed from the beginning? Immediately after the horrific robbery and shooting at the house in San Antonio, police swiftly launched an investigation. Initially, the only lead was Juan Moreno's description of 2 Hispanic males, one around 14 and one around 19 years old. However, due to his severe injuries, Moreno could not speak and could barely move when police visited him at the hospital the day after the shooting. 5 days later, in a second interview, Moreno was shown several photos, but Cantu's picture was not among them, and Moreno did not identify anyone. On December 16th, detectives visited Moreno a 3rd time and showed him another set of 5 photos this time, including a picture of Ruben Cantu, who lived across the street from Moreno's workplace where the crime occurred. Again, Moreno still did not identify Cantu or anyone else from those photos. The case went cold, and no suspects were arrested until a dramatic event unfolded. Approximately 4 months after the robbery murder, Cantu shot Joe de la Luz, an off-duty plainclothes police officer, at a bar near Cantu's home. The case against Cantu for the bar shooting was eventually dropped because police had illegally searched Cantu's home. However, Officer De La Luz survived. A friend of his, Sergeant Bill Ewell, who worked in the homicide division, decided to immediately reopen the murder investigation against Ruben Cantu. The next day, Sergeant Ewell sent an investigator to Juan Moreno for a fourth time, showing him photos of Cantu and 4 others. Juan Moreno still did not identify Cantu as one of his attackers, but he did provide Cantu's name. A day later, a third homicide detective picked up Moreno. Then an undocumented immigrant from Mexico drove him to the police station, made him sit down, and showed him the same photo array that included Cantu. On that third attempt, Moreno positively identified Cantu's photo as one of his attackers. Years later, Moreno stated that the person who shot him had very curly hair and that he was never shown a photo of the actual shooter. David Garza, Cantu's accomplice, also admitted to being present at the scene, but asserted that the actual killer was not Ruben Cantu, but rather a childhood friend of Cantu. This individual later denied involvement when interviewed. Was this investigation truly objective and accurate, or was it influenced by external factors leading to the conviction of someone who might have been innocent? The trial of Ruben Cantu for murder and armed robbery took place in 1985 in San Antonio, Texas. He was prosecuted on charges related to the death of Pedro Gomez and the robbery of Juan Moreno. The prosecution's main argument rested on the testimony of Juan Moreno, the surviving victim, who repeatedly identified Ruben Cantu in court as one of his attackers. They emphasized the brutality of the armed robbery and Gomez's brutal shooting death. Despite initial indications of uncertainty in Moreno's identification, his testimony in court became the key piece of evidence. Cantu's defense faced many challenges. Cantu maintained his innocence and claimed he was framed, but the evidence available at the time, particularly Moreno's identification, weighed against him. Notably, Cantu himself had written a note to the people of San Antonio stating, "I was framed for a capital murder. I was framed for shooting an off-duty police officer named Joe De La Luz." This suggested he believed the murder case was retaliation for the shooting of the officer. In 1985, the jury found Ruben Cantu guilty of murder and armed robbery. He was sentenced to death. This verdict made Cantu one of the youngest juvenile offenders to be sentenced to capital punishment. The victims' families undoubtedly felt relief with the conviction of the perpetrator.